I created a series of tests and had my 3 children go through these tests to see, is it possible for a child to break a G-Shock watch? Hey everyone, this is Dave. Welcome back to Just the Watch, and today I'm going to be showing you the tests that I put this watch through, the tortures that I put it through, or not necessarily me, but my 3 kids. Recently I reviewed this watch, and the reason I purchased initially was I wanted to do kind of a torture test of my own from sort of a practical standpoint, because, again, my impression of G-Shock watches is that they are some of the toughest watches on the planet, and really, the only way they're going to break is if you intentionally try to break them, which nobody normally does. But from a real world perspective, I could see a case where a kid or my kids might get into my watches and be having some fun or something and might play too rough with them and potentially, do something to break them. In order to make sure this was a fair test, I also purchased 2 other kind of control watches to see how they would fare. I got a $1 watch from the dollar store and a $3 watch and put them through the exact same tests. Now, the way I decided to run this test was basically the same way I would run a piñata at a birthday party. Right? If you got a piñata, you always have the youngest kids go first, and then you move on to the older kids, because if you let the older kids go first, they'll break the thing, and the younger kids will not have any fun. So that's, metaphorically speaking, the way that I structured this test. That was a good one. I have a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and an 8-year-old, and I let each one of them run through all 5 of these tests in order, and then went from youngest to oldest to do it. These are the 5 tests that I ran the watches through: the chuck, the bat, the hammer, the stomp, and the freestyle. Okay, you have 10 seconds. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, set, go. First off, I had my 3-year-old throw the watches against the wall as hard as he could, which was very cute and not very hard. Okay, now throw it against the wall as hard as you can. Okay, throw it against the wall as hard as you can. And throw that one against the wall. He's also not terribly coordinated with the bat, so they fared pretty well through that test as well. You missed. Okay, good. Good.
This is the second test.
I got mildly nervous when it came to the hammer, but he's still just a 3-year-old, and try as he might, he couldn't really do much of a dent in them. The stomp he was decidedly more effective at, and that seemed to be kind of a good indication of his level of coordination and the best way that he could use his weight. But even still, with his little rain boots, he still had trouble doing much of a scratch on any of the watches. Now, the whole idea of this test is to see if a child could break the watch, and, not only, and I think the test of this is not just the child's physical strength, but also their creative potential for destruction. So that's why the freestyle was the final test, where basically I told the kids, whatever you can think of to do to the watches, go for it. And here's what the 3-year-old came up with. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. Now, all of the watches came through the 3-year-old's tests with only minor scuffs and scratches on it. And I was thinking at this point, I'm probably going to do pretty good. And I started thinking, if I can get the watch to survive it, this is a pink G-Shock, but if I can get it to survive with only minor cosmetic damages, maybe I'll do like a full metal upgrade and get one of the kits from AliExpress, and it might be a fun thing because this is kind of a cool movement inside of it. But I bought the watch specifically to test it for this purposes, so I wanted to go through and get it done. Next up, I had my 5-year-old daughter have a go. When it came to chucking the watches up against the wall, the $3 watch started to break and show some signs. The plastic bezel and plastic crystal of the watch completely popped off, but I was able to kind of stick it back together and put it back on so that she could go through the other tests of, again, trying as hard as she could to hit it with a piñata bat, trying to hammer it, stomping on it, and then having her own little 10-second temper tantrum with each watch, trying to break them. Keep going, keep going.
Ow.
I was a little bit more impressed with her ferocity when it came to this one, but still, at the end of the test, all of the watches, except for the $3 one, were in pretty good shape, and even the $3 one was still functioning. It just, had a very loose crystal and bezel popping it off. Finally, it was up to my 8-year-old son to be the hero and see if he could succeed where the other kids had failed. And this is where things started to get a little bit dicey. When it came to chucking the watches against the wall, again, the $3 one suffered the worst, and at this point, I kind of gave up trying to get the bezel and the crystal back onto it. Again, coordination seemed to be the hardest thing when it comes to hitting such a small thing dangling by a string, and all of the watches fared pretty well through that one. The hammer was maybe one of my most nerve-wracking tests. I was worried that if they were able to actually get down to the crystal of the G-Shock, they could shatter that one. But try as he might, my 8-year-old wasn't able to do any significant damage with the wooden mallet that I had purchased for this test. For the stomp, he opted for a nice 2-footed jump onto each of the watches, which, while looking very painful, again, didn't do a significant amount of damage. And so at this point at the test, I was a little bit slightly disappointed, but again, slightly encouraged, as, looking forward to the extra uses I could get out of this watch. The watches at this point, they had some noticeable scuffs and scratches on them. But again, aside from that $3 one, they were all still functioning in pretty good shape. This G-Shock that I was doing the main test on, it's a pretty cool G-Shock. It's part of the G-Lide series. It has a tide graph, a world timer, pretty cool backlight, a lot of interesting stuff inside it. And so again, I didn't like the color of it that much. And so I was hoping that it would kind of survive and that I would get to use it for other projects going forward. And that's where I might have gotten a little bit overconfident in my tests and maybe underestimated the destructive capacity of my kids. Because when it came to the freestyle, my 8-year-old son was decidedly more determined than the younger ones. He managed to find a very large rock and asked if he could throw that at the watches. And this is where I realized very quickly that I had made a terrible mistake in running these tests.
Okay, bring it over here, let's see. Alright, that one's gone. Not close, Alice, don't get so close. Try again. Okay, one more time.
During my son's alone time with the watch, he managed to create 3 major damage points on it. The first obviously being that he was able to completely pop a spring bar out. None of the case and the band are both completely intact. It was just the spring bar popped out and flew off somewhere. I wasn't able to find it. But if I could find another spring bar, I could easily repair that part of it. The other damage that he did was significantly more. The first was that he kind of cracked the shroud on the watch, which caused some major cosmetic damage, but again, didn't affect the function of the watch. But it appears that at least one of his overhanded, two-handed rock throws onto the watch managed to land directly on one of the buttons, bending it so that it no longer is depressible, and now the adjust button does not work on the watch anymore. I did a little bit of an autopsy on this thing to see if I could figure out how much I could salvage, and I was actually pretty impressed in doing that to look at the way that the G-Shock is structured. There's a couple of layers of protection on here, and given the violence that was done to this watch, I'm actually really impressed at how intact it is. The watch module inside was completely protected from all of those tests. From all of the damage that was done. The case and the design of it completely protected the module. The module is fully functional. I was able to take it out. All of the buttons still work on the module itself. It's just, the actual external buttons that depress in that are bent in that one case so that they don't actually depress from the outside. But if they did work, or if I could straighten them out, it could still, the module inside is completely fine. So if you start taking apart one of these G-Shock squares, what you find is that there is this outer shroud that is the first layer of protection. It gives it a nice raised bevel over the crystal, so that it kind of gives it some protection there, and just acts as the first point of shock absorption. Underneath that, you have this other kind of plastic-like shroud that protects the module itself. and that's where these buttons are kind of mounted into. And the buttons are built in such a way so that they are not directly connected to the module inside at all. So that's again one of the protective things. So if the buttons were in some way directly connected to the module, when a rock hit it, it probably would have damaged the module inside. But because of the way that they've designed it, the watch was able to take a direct hit from a heavy rock being thrown very violently to the point where it bended the button so that it no longer functions. But that did not affect the actual module inside, and in all of that force onto the side of the case, it didn't collapse, it didn't compress to the point of damaging the module, which is really impressive. The watch is basically still functioning inside. It's still working. It's just now that one single button that doesn't work. So from a technical perspective, talking about a G-Shock functioning the way it should, it did that. The watch, all of the protections that they built in here to protect that module, that quartz module inside of it, it worked, and the module is completely fine. But the external parts of it were damaged to the point where some functions are no longer functioning as it is. Now, where does this leave me? Again, my hope was that I could sort of, take off the outer part, get one of those metal conversion kits and use that. But because the button itself is damaged, I would have to replace or somehow be able to fix that. The sort of white, the shroud inside is also a little bit damaged, which, might have hurt the water resistance. So I've lost a lot of integrity on the case of this watch, to the point that I'm not really that, interested in upgrading this particular one. In order to fix it, I think I would need to get a new sort of inner shroud and button enclosure, but I couldn't really find any options for that online. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with this one now, because it's not in that good a shape. And even though the module inside still works, not being able to use the adjust button is kind of a bummer. So that's where it leaves me. But that's going to wrap up our testing for today. I hope that this is actually somewhat helpful for you if you're trying to determine how tough one of these G-Shocks are. Again, even though the G-Shock, I think, technically failed, if you're talking about who won, the children or the G-Shock, I think I got to give the win to the kids here. But the G-Shock still did really good compared to what I thought. I did not expect my children to come up with the idea of throwing a giant rock against it multiple times. But that's kids for you. So that will wrap it up for today. Thank you guys for watching, and let me know what you think down below. We'll talk to you later. Bye.